June 22, 1944. Exactly 3 years after Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. The date was not chosen by accident. Stalin remembered. The Red Army remembered. And on this summer morning in Belarus, the largest military offensive in human history was about to begin. Operation Bagration, named after a Russian general who had fought Napoleon. The objective was simple in concept, catastrophic in execution. Destroy Army Group Center. Annihilate 1.2 million Wehrmacht troops occupying Soviet territory. Liberate Belarus. Open the road to Berlin. What happened over the next 13 days would surpass Stalingrad in scale, exceed Kursk in ferocity, and dwarf D-Day in casualties. In less than 2 weeks, the Red Army would inflict on Nazi Germany the single most devastating defeat in military history. An entire army group would cease to exist. Cities would burn, tens of thousands would die, and the Wehrmacht would never recover. But in the early morning hours of June 22, 1944, the German soldiers manning defensive positions across Belarus had no idea what was coming. They sat in bunkers and trenches, watching the forest, smoking cigarettes, writing letters home. Some slept, some played cards. Most were exhausted from 3 years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. These men belonged to Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch. The formation stretched across 500 kilometers of territory in central Belarus. 4 armies, approximately 1.2 million troops, 9,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, 1,350 aircraft. It was one of the largest concentrations of military power Germany still possessed in June 1944. But Army Group Center had problems, serious problems, problems that would prove fatal. First, the defensive line was overextended. 500 kilometers is an enormous distance to defend. The Wehrmacht didn't have enough men to create proper depth. Positions were thinly held. Reserves were inadequate. Gaps existed that couldn't be properly covered. Second, the troops were exhausted. Many had been fighting since 1941. They had survived 3 Russian winters. They had endured Stalingrad, Kursk, countless smaller battles. These were not the fresh, confident soldiers who had invaded the Soviet Union 3 years earlier. These were worn-down, depleted veterans who wanted nothing more than to survive and go home. Third, intelligence had failed. German command believed the main Soviet summer offensive would come in Ukraine, targeting Army Group North Ukraine. That's where they had concentrated reserves, positioned their best divisions, prepared their strongest defenses. Belarus was considered a secondary sector, a quiet zone, a place where exhausted divisions could rest and refit. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. The Red Army had been planning Operation Bagration for months. Stalin personally oversaw the preparations. Marshal Georgy Zhukov coordinated the overall strategy. 4 front commanders would execute the attack. Generals Bagration, Chernyakhovsky, Zakharov, and Rokossovsky. Each commanded hundreds of thousands of troops. Each had specific objectives. Each was determined to destroy the enemy completely. The Soviet forces assembled for Bagration were staggering in scale. 2.4 million troops, 4 times the number defending against them. 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, nearly 6 times German armor strength. 36,000 artillery pieces and mortars, 4 times the German artillery. 5,300 aircraft, nearly 4 times Luftwaffe strength in the sector. But numbers alone don't win battles. The Red Army had learned this painful lesson in 1941, when superior numbers had failed to stop the Wehrmacht's advance. What mattered was how those numbers were employed. And by June 1944, the Red Army had become masters of operational warfare. Soviet strategy for Bagration was elegant in its simplicity. don't attack everywhere at once. Concentrate overwhelming force at specific breakthrough points. Punch holes in the German line. Pour mobile forces through those gaps. Encircle enemy formations. Destroy them methodically. Then advance to the next objective. The Soviets identified 6 main breakthrough sectors. Each would receive massive concentrations of artillery, tanks, and infantry. The plan called for artillery densities of 200 to 300 guns per kilometer of front in these sectors. Numbers that would reduce German defensive positions to smoking craters within hours. But achieving surprise was critical. If the Germans realized what was coming, they might withdraw to better positions. They might call in reserves. They might disrupt the Soviet timetable. So the Red Army implemented an elaborate deception campaign. Soviet units moved into position at night. Camouflage was extensive. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Dummy positions were created to confuse German reconnaissance. False information was leaked, suggesting attacks would come elsewhere. Partisan activity intensified behind German lines, disrupting communications and creating chaos. The deception worked. German intelligence detected increased Soviet activity, but assessed it as defensive preparations. Army Group Center Command remained convinced that any major offensive would target Ukraine, not Belarus. Field Marshal Bush requested permission to withdraw to better defensive positions. Hitler refused. The Führer had issued standing orders forbidding voluntary retreats. Every inch of occupied territory must be held. Bush was ordered to defend his current lines. This decision doomed Army Group Center before the battle even began. June 19, 1944. Soviet partisans behind German lines received orders. Simultaneous attacks on railways, bridges, communication centers. Over 10,000 demolitions were carried out in a single night. Railway traffic ground to a halt. German communications were severed. Reinforcements couldn't move. Intelligence couldn't flow. Army Group Center was being systematically blinded and paralyzed. June 22, 1944, 4:02 a.m., the artillery preparation began. 36,000 Soviet guns and mortars opened fire simultaneously across a 500-kilometer front. The sound was heard 100 kilometers away. The ground shook. Trees splintered. Earth erupted skyward. German bunkers collapsed. Trenches caved in. Communication wires were cut. Observation posts were obliterated. The bombardment lasted 2 hours in some sectors, 4 hours in others. Soviet artillery fired pre-planned barrages with devastating precision. First, suppress enemy artillery. Second, destroy frontline positions. Third, interdict rear areas to prevent reinforcement. The execution was methodical, relentless, overwhelming. German survivors described it as hell on earth. The noise was unbearable. The concussive force threw men through the air. Soldiers went deaf. Some went insane from the stress. When the barrage finally lifted, entire defensive positions had simply ceased to exist. Then came the infantry. Soviet rifle divisions advanced behind rolling artillery barrages. Where German resistance remained strong, the infantry halted. More artillery was called in. Positions were pulverized. Then the infantry advanced again. This methodical approach minimized Soviet casualties while maximizing destruction of enemy positions. At 9:00 a.m., Soviet armor was committed. Thousands of T-34 tanks and self-propelled guns pushed through gaps in the German line. Their mission was not to fight defensive battles. Their mission was to drive deep, bypass resistance, encircle enemy formations, seize key objectives. By noon on June 22nd, German front lines had been penetrated in multiple locations. By evening, Soviet forces had advanced 15 to 20 kilometers in breakthrough sectors. Army Group Center was fragmenting. Field Marshal Busch finally grasped the magnitude of the catastrophe unfolding. He contacted Hitler's headquarters, requesting permission to withdraw threatened divisions to avoid encirclement. Hitler refused. The order remained unchanged. Hold all positions. No retreats. Busch was informed that elite divisions were being sent as reinforcements. He should counterattack and restore the line. But those elite divisions were hundreds of kilometers away. They couldn't possibly arrive in time. And even if they did, Soviet forces were advancing so rapidly that any reinforcements would arrive to find the situation had already changed completely. June 23rd. The Soviet advance accelerated. In the northern sector, forces under General Bagration penetrated 40 kilometers beyond the initial German line. In the center, General Chernyakhovsky's tanks were racing toward Vitebsk, a critical communications hub where 40,000 German troops were stationed. General Georg Pfeiffer commanded the Vitebsk garrison. He watched Soviet forces approaching from multiple directions and understood immediately that his position was becoming surrounded. He radioed Busch requesting permission to evacuate the city. Busch forwarded the request to Hitler. Hitler's response was unambiguous. Vitebsk must be held. It was designated a fortified place. No withdrawal was authorized. Pfeiffer obeyed. His 40,000 men prepared to defend Vitebsk. But the city's fortifications were inadequate. Supplies were limited. Soviet forces vastly outnumbered the garrison, and more Red Army units were arriving every hour. By June 24th, Vitebsk was completely encircled. Soviet forces had advanced past the city on both sides, cutting all roads and rail lines. The garrison was trapped. 40,000 Wehrmacht troops, with no supply line, no reinforcements, and no possibility of escape. Inside Vitebsk, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. Buildings collapsed. Fires spread. Casualties mounted. Food supplies dwindled. Ammunition ran low. The garrison's radio frantically requested air supply and relief operations. The Luftwaffe attempted supply drops, but Soviet fighters dominated the airspace. Most supply aircraft were shot down. The few that got through delivered only a fraction of what was needed. No relief force was coming. The divisions Hitler had promised were still days away, fighting through their own Soviet encirclements. By June 26th, General Pfeiffer realized his position was hopeless. His troops were starving. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Soviet forces were systematically reducing the defensive perimeter. Surrender or annihilation were the only options remaining. Pfeiffer made one final attempt to break out. He ordered his remaining mobile forces to attack westward, attempting to punch through Soviet lines and escape. The breakout began at dawn on June 27th. It was a desperate gamble. It failed catastrophically. Soviet forces were waiting. Anti-tank guns destroyed German armor. Machine guns cut down infantry. Artillery turned the breakout route into a killing ground. Of the 40,000 troops attempting escape, only a few hundred made it through Soviet lines. The rest were killed or captured. General Pfeiffer was among the dead. Vitebsk fell on June 27th. 40,000 Wehrmacht troops eliminated in 5 days. But Vitebsk was only one pocket. Simultaneously, similar encirclements were developing across the entire front. To the south, the city of Bobruisk had become another trap. General Gotthard Hofmeister commanded approximately 40,000 troops defending the city and surrounding area. Like Pfeiffer at Vitebsk, Hofmeister watched Soviet mobile forces sweeping around his flanks. Like Pfeiffer, he requested permission to withdraw. Like Pfeiffer, he was ordered to hold. The encirclement of Bobruisk closed on June 27th. Soviet tanks linked up east and west of the city. Hofmeister's forces were surrounded. The Red Army offered surrender terms. Hofmeister refused. Hitler had ordered resistance to the last man. Soviet artillery subjected Bobruisk to a devastating bombardment. The city was systematically destroyed. German casualties climbed into the thousands. Hofmeister finally attempted a breakout on June 29th. It ended in disaster. Soviet forces annihilated the breakout columns. Hofmeister was killed. Of his 40,000 troops, fewer than 15,000 escaped the pocket. The rest perished or surrendered. But the greatest catastrophe was still developing. The entire German Ninth Army was being encircled. General Hans Jordan commanded the Ninth Army, approximately 100,000 troops holding positions in central Belarus. Jordan was an experienced officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front. He recognized immediately that Operation Bagration threatened to destroy his entire command. Soviet forces under General Rokossovsky were executing a classic double envelopment. Tank corps were driving around both flanks of the Ninth Army simultaneously. Jordan's frontline divisions were fighting desperately, but Soviet pressure was relentless. German positions were collapsing. Jordan contacted Field Marshal Bush. The situation was critical. The Ninth Army must withdraw immediately or face complete encirclement. Bush agreed. He contacted Hitler's headquarters. Once again, Hitler refused. The Ninth Army would hold its positions. No retreats were authorized. Jordan protested. If the Ninth Army didn't withdraw in the next 24 hours, it would be too late. The Soviet pincers would close. 100,000 troops would be trapped. Bush forwarded the protest to Berlin. Hitler's response was to relieve Bush of command. Field Marshal Walter Model was appointed as Bush's replacement. Model was one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders. He had a reputation for stabilizing crisis situations. Hitler believed Model could save Army Group Center, but even Model couldn't work miracles. When he arrived to assume command on June 28th, he immediately grasped that the situation was beyond salvaging. The Soviet pincers around the Ninth Army closed near the city of Minsk on June 3rd. Over 100,000 German troops were trapped in a massive pocket east of the Belarusian capital. Soviet forces established multiple rings of encirclement. The outer ring prevented relief forces from reaching the pocket. The inner ring prevented the trapped Germans from breaking out. Inside the Minsk pocket, chaos reigned. Command and control had broken down. Communication with higher headquarters was lost. Supply columns were destroyed. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Ammunition stocks were depleted. Water was scarce. Food was running out. General Jordan attempted to organize his scattered divisions for a coordinated breakout, but Soviet forces were too strong. Every breakout attempt was repulsed with heavy casualties. Red Army artillery pounded the pocket continuously. Soviet aircraft attacked German positions without opposition. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. By July 3rd, the situation had become untenable. Units were surrendering en masse. Wounded soldiers lay untreated in field hospitals with no medicine, no bandages, no hope. Officers shot themselves rather than face capture. The Ninth Army was disintegrating. Jordan made one final breakout attempt on July 8th. He assembled his remaining mobile forces for a desperate thrust westward. Perhaps 20,000 troops participated in this last attempt to escape. They attacked at dawn. Soviet defenders were ready. Anti-tank guns destroyed German vehicles. Artillery decimated infantry formations. Machine gun fire cut down anyone who reached Soviet lines. The breakout collapsed within hours. Thousands lay dead. The survivors staggered back into the shrinking pocket. There was nothing left to do but surrender or die. General Jordan chose surrender. On July 8, 1944, the remnants of the German Ninth Army laid down their weapons. over 70,000 troops marched into Soviet captivity. Another 30,000 lay dead in the forests and fields around Minsk. The destruction of the Ninth Army represented the single largest encirclement battle of World War II. More troops were captured at Minsk than at Stalingrad. More territory was liberated in less time than during any other Soviet offensive. The Wehrmacht had suffered a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. But the disaster wasn't finished. Even as the Minsk pocket collapsed, Soviet forces continued their westward advance. There was no defensive line to stop them. There were no reserves to throw into the gap. Army Group Center had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Field Marshal Model desperately attempted to establish a new defensive line. He scraped together fragments of shattered divisions, hurriedly assembled Luftwaffe ground personnel into infantry units, called up rear area security forces, anything to create some semblance of organized resistance. It wasn't enough. Soviet tank corps were advancing 30 to 40 kilometers per day. They bypassed German strongpoints, seized river crossings before defenders could prepare them, captured supply depots intact, overran headquarters complexes. The Red Army was operating deep in what had been secure German rear areas. Cities fell in rapid succession: Polotsk on July 4th, Vilnius on July 13th, Grodno on July 16th. Each city had been designated by Hitler as a fortified place to be held at all costs. Each fell within days of being surrounded. Tens of thousands more Wehrmacht troops were killed or captured. By mid-July, Soviet forces had advanced nearly 600 kilometers from their starting positions. They had crossed into Poland. They had reached the outskirts of East Prussia. Army Group Center, which had numbered 2 million troops on June 22nd, had been reduced to scattered remnants totaling perhaps 200,000 effective combat soldiers. German casualties were staggering. Official Wehrmacht records, incomplete and fragmentary, acknowledge the loss of approximately 300,000 troops killed, wounded, or missing. Soviet sources claim over 450,000 German casualties. The true number likely falls somewhere in between, but even the conservative German figure represents one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. Beyond the raw numbers, Army Group Center lost virtually all its heavy equipment. Thousands of artillery pieces were destroyed or captured. Nearly all tanks and assault guns were lost. Hundreds of aircraft were shot down or abandoned at overrun airfields. Massive supply depots fell into Soviet hands intact. The operational consequences were equally severe. The entire German defensive line in the east had collapsed. A 400-kilometer gap now existed where Army Group Center had once stood. Soviet forces could advance virtually unopposed toward Germany's borders. The Wehrmacht had no reserves available to close this gap. Divisions were being transferred from France, from the Balkans, from Scandinavia, but they would take weeks to arrive. The strategic implications were profound. Germany was now fighting a two-front war it could not win. In the West, Anglo-American forces had broken out of Normandy and were advancing across France. In the East, the Red Army was driving toward the Reich. German industry was being pulverized by round-the-clock bombing. Manpower was exhausted. Fuel was scarce. The war was lost, though Hitler refused to acknowledge this reality. But beyond statistics and strategic analysis, Operation Bagration was a human catastrophe of immense proportions. Hundreds of thousands of young men, German and Soviet alike, perished in the forests and fields of Belarus. Cities were reduced to ruins. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, killed by artillery, murdered by retreating Germans, executed by advancing Soviets. The scale of suffering was almost incomprehensible. German prisoners were marched hundreds of kilometers to captivity. Many died along the way from exhaustion, disease, exposure. Those who survived faced years of brutal labor in Soviet camps. Tens of thousands would never return home. Soviet casualties, though lower than German losses, were still substantial. Official Soviet figures acknowledge approximately 180,000 troops killed, wounded, or missing. The actual number was likely higher. The Red Army's offensive tactics prioritized speed over caution. Reconnaissance was often inadequate. Attacks were pressed forward even when casualties mounted. Victory was achieved, but at a heavy price. The civilian population of Belarus paid the highest price of all. The region had already endured 3 years of occupation, partisan warfare, and German anti-partisan operations. Now it became a battlefield. Villages were destroyed, farms were burned, infrastructure was obliterated, hundreds of thousands of civilians were displaced, killed, or left destitute. German atrocities intensified as the Wehrmacht retreated. SS units and police battalions massacred civilians suspected of partisan sympathies. Jews who had survived 3 years of occupation were now hunted down and murdered before Soviet forces could liberate them. Entire communities were destroyed in the final weeks of German occupation. Soviet forces, while liberating Belarus from Nazi occupation, brought their own forms of repression. NKVD units followed close behind the advancing Red Army. Anyone suspected of collaboration with the Germans was arrested. Partisan groups not under communist control were disbanded or eliminated. A new form of occupation was beginning even as liberation was celebrated. For the German military, Operation Bagration represented a disaster comparable to Stalingrad, but on a far larger scale. At Stalingrad, one army had been destroyed. In Belarus, an entire army group had been annihilated. The Wehrmacht would never recover from this blow. Hitler's reaction to the catastrophe was characteristically delusional. He blamed his generals for the defeat. Field Marshal Busch was dismissed. General Jordan was blamed for the Ninth Army's destruction. Other commanders were relieved or reassigned. Hitler refused to acknowledge that his own strategic decisions, particularly the order forbidding withdrawals, had been primarily responsible for the disaster. The Führer convened a conference at his East Prussian headquarters on July 20th to discuss the crisis. Among those present was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who had placed a bomb in a briefcase under the conference table. The assassination attempt failed. Hitler survived with minor injuries. The conspirators were rounded up and executed. But the fact that senior Wehrmacht officers had attempted to kill Hitler demonstrated how desperate Germany's situation had become. In the aftermath of Bagration, the Wehrmacht attempted to stabilize the Eastern Front. Divisions were transferred from other theaters. New defensive lines were established. Field Marshal Model, now commanding both Army Group Center and Army Group North Ukraine, worked tirelessly to create cohesive defenses. But the strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Soviets. The Red Army now possessed overwhelming superiority in manpower, equipment, and operational skill. Soviet commanders had learned how to conduct massive offensive operations with devastating efficiency. The Wehrmacht could delay but not prevent the final Soviet advance into Germany. Operation Bagration continued into August 1944, though the main phase concluded in mid-July. Soviet forces pushed into Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. Warsaw saw an uprising by Polish resistance forces, expecting Soviet support that never came. The Red Army halted at the Vistula River, consolidating gains and preparing for the next offensive. By the time operations finally concluded in late August, the Red Army had liberated all of Belarus, most of Lithuania, and significant portions of Poland. Soviet forces stood on the borders of East Prussia. The advance had covered over 600 kilometers in just over 2 months. No comparable offensive operation had ever been conducted in military history. The victory came at tremendous cost. Soviet casualties exceeded 750,000, killed, wounded, and missing for the entire operation. Thousands of tanks and aircraft were lost. But the Red Army could replace these losses. Germany could not. For Nazi Germany, Operation Bagration represented the beginning of the end. The Wehrmacht had suffered its greatest defeat. Army Group Center was destroyed. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied forces were advancing from the west. The strategic situation was hopeless. Yet the war would continue for another 10 months. Hitler refused all suggestions of negotiated surrender. German forces would fight on, inflicting and suffering casualties, destroying cities, until final collapse in May 1945. The soldiers who survived the Bagration catastrophe would fight in subsequent defensive battles. Those captured would spend years in Soviet labor camps. Many would never return. The officers who had pleaded with Hitler for permission to withdraw, only to be overruled, would carry the knowledge that hundreds of thousands of their men had died needlessly. In the Soviet Union, Operation Bagration was celebrated as one of the Red Army's greatest victories. Stalin promoted the successful commanders. Zhukov's reputation as the Soviet Union's greatest general was solidified. Cities were renamed in honor of military heroes. Victory parades were held in liberated territories, but the human cost was remembered as well. Memorials were erected across Belarus to those who fell in the liberation. Mass graves held thousands of Soviet and German dead. The forests and fields where battles raged became silent testaments to the price of war. In the West, Operation Bagration received relatively little attention. The Normandy invasion and subsequent campaign in France dominated Allied news coverage. The scale of the Soviet offensive in Belarus was not widely understood or appreciated by Western populations. Even today, Bagration remains less well known than Stalingrad or Kursk, despite being larger in scope and consequence. Military historians have extensively studied Bagration as an example of operational art. The Soviet coordination of multiple fronts, the deception measures, the concentration of overwhelming force at decisive points, the rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, all demonstrated sophisticated understanding of modern warfare. German military analysts after the war acknowledged that Bagration represented the culmination of Soviet operational development. The Red Army of 1944 bore little resemblance to the disorganized force that had been surprised and defeated in 1941. Soviet commanders had learned from their mistakes. They had developed effective doctrine. They had created the logistical systems necessary to support massive offensive operations. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, had failed to adapt. German defensive doctrine still relied on holding every position, refusing to yield ground, counterattacking to restore lines. These methods had worked when Germany possessed superiority in training, equipment, and leadership. By 1944, the Wehrmacht no longer held those advantages. Yet German doctrine remained unchanged, with predictably catastrophic results. Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of occupied territory proved particularly disastrous. At Stalingrad, this inflexibility had cost an entire army. At Bagration, it cost an entire army group. German commanders recognized the problem but lacked the authority or courage to disobey. Those who argued too strongly for withdrawals were dismissed or reassigned. The few German commanders who managed successful defensive operations during Bagration did so by quietly ignoring Hitler's orders. They conducted local withdrawals, avoided encirclement, preserved their forces for subsequent defensive lines. But these officers were exceptions. Most obeyed orders, held untenable positions, and sacrificed their men for no strategic purpose. For the Soviet commanders, Bagration represented vindication. They had proposed the operation despite skepticism from some quarters. They had planned meticulously. They had executed brilliantly. The result was the greatest victory in Soviet military history. Marshal Zhukov, who coordinated the overall operation, considered Bagration his finest achievement. The strategic deception, the timing, the coordination of 4 separate fronts, all bore his imprint. Stalin acknowledged Zhukov's success by granting him increasing authority in subsequent operations. General Rokossovsky, whose forces encircled and destroyed the German Ninth Army, emerged as one of the war's most capable operational commanders. His handling of mobile forces, his timing of encirclement operations, his coordination of multiple corps demonstrated mastery of modern warfare. The other front commanders, Bagration, Chernyakhovsky, and Zakharov, each contributed to the overall success. Their ability to maintain operational tempo, to exploit opportunities, to adapt to changing circumstances, all proved crucial to achieving the scope and scale of victory that Bagration represented. In the decades since 1944, Operation Bagration has been studied by military professionals worldwide. The operation demonstrates the devastating effectiveness of properly coordinated combined arms warfare. The concentration of artillery, the timing of armor commitment, the use of air power, the exploitation of breakthroughs all provide lessons for modern military doctrine. The operation also demonstrates the catastrophic consequences of strategic inflexibility. Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawals turned tactical defeats into strategic catastrophes. Had Army Group Center been permitted to conduct fighting withdrawals, many divisions could have been saved. The defensive line could have been shortened. Subsequent Soviet operations would have faced more effective resistance. Instead, Hitler's insistence on holding every position resulted in the loss of nearly 500,000 troops in less than 2 months. These losses were irreplaceable. The divisions destroyed in Belarus could have fought defensive battles in Poland, slowing the Soviet advance, buying time for political negotiations or miracle weapons to change the war's outcome. But no negotiations were possible. Hitler refused all peace feelers. No miracle weapons materialized. The war would continue until Germany's complete destruction. For the people of Belarus, the liberation from Nazi occupation came at terrible cost. The region had been devastated by 3 years of occupation, partisan warfare, and anti-partisan operations. Now, 2 months of intensive combat completed the destruction. Cities lay in ruins. Villages were burned. Infrastructure was obliterated. The population had been decimated by war, occupation, and famine. The Soviet liberation brought an end to Nazi terror but initiated new forms of repression. The NKVD arrested thousands suspected of collaboration. Entire communities were deported. The region would remain under authoritarian control for another 5 decades. Yet despite the suffering, liberation was celebrated. Nazi occupation had been characterized by mass murder, forced labor, starvation, and constant terror. Soviet rule, while repressive, did not include the systematic extermination of the population. For survivors, liberation meant an end to the immediate threat of death. The memory of Operation Bagration remains significant in Belarus today. June 22nd is marked as the anniversary of the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. July 3rd, the date Minsk was liberated, is celebrated as Independence Day. Memorials across the country commemorate those who fell in the liberation. In Russia, Bagration is remembered as one of the Soviet Union's greatest military achievements. The operation demonstrated the Red Army's capability to conduct massive offensive operations against determined opposition. The victory helped establish Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe that would last until 1991. In Germany, Bagration represents trauma. The scale of the defeat, the loss of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the collapse of the Eastern Front, all contributed to Germany's eventual surrender. Veterans who survived the catastrophe carried memories of chaos, defeat, and suffering for the rest of their lives. For military historians, Bagration represents a case study in operational art. The planning, deception, coordination, and execution all demonstrate sophisticated understanding of modern warfare. The operation showed what could be achieved when overwhelming force was concentrated at decisive points and exploited with skill and determination. The lessons of Bagration remain relevant. The importance of intelligence and deception, the value of operational flexibility, the necessity of coordinating multiple forces toward common objectives, the devastating effectiveness of massed artillery, the crucial role of mobile forces in exploiting breakthroughs, all continue to inform military doctrine. But perhaps the most important lesson is the human cost of war. Operation Bagration killed or wounded over 1 million soldiers, German and Soviet combined. Hundreds of thousands of civilians perished. Cities were destroyed. Millions were displaced. The suffering was immense and largely preventable. The war that produced Bagration should never have been fought. Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was criminal aggression that ultimately destroyed Germany itself. The conquest, occupation, and exploitation of Eastern Europe led directly to Germany's annihilation. Millions died for Hitler's delusional vision of racial empire. By June 1944, the war's outcome was inevitable. Germany had lost. Continuing the fight served no purpose beyond prolonging suffering, yet Hitler refused surrender. His generals, with few exceptions, obeyed his orders. Hundreds of thousands more would die in battles that changed nothing strategically but inflicted immense human suffering. Operation Bagration stands as testament to war's destructive power. In 13 days, an entire army group was annihilated. Hundreds of thousands perished. A region was devastated. And the war continued for 10 more months, producing millions more casualties before final surrender. The soldiers who marched into battle on June 22, 1944, German and Soviet alike, were young men far from home, fighting for causes most barely understood. They displayed courage, endurance, and sacrifice. Many never saw their homes again. Their graves dot the fields and forests of Belarus, silent witnesses to war's terrible cost. Operation Bagration was the largest offensive operation in military history. It destroyed Nazi Germany's Army Group Center. It liberated Belarus. It opened the road to Berlin. And it demonstrated, with terrible clarity, the price of war.